Sting is regarded as one of the most successful and prolific songwriters in modern music. Winner of 17 Grammy Awards, nominated for 4 Academy Awards for Best Original Song. He's had 11 songs in the top 10, 5 as a solo artist, 6 with the Police, including his iconic hit Every Breath You Take, which spent 8 weeks in the #1 spot back in 1983. So it may surprise you to know how Sting actually writes his songs. In this video, we're going to look at Sting's songwriting process in fine detail and try and understand how and why it's been so effective for the last 45 years. And we're also going to take some of his insights and turn them into a songwriting checklist that we can use when writing our own songs. And a big shout out to Soda Jerker on Songwriting, who have created an incredible podcast full of interviews with some amazing songwriters. And a lot of the material for this video came from their interview they did with Sting back in 2019. So if you're interested in the full interview, I'll put a link below. I work backwards. I start with a title, which is usually the same as the refrain, and then go backwards. You have a title like Message in a Bottle. What does that mean? Who sends messages in bottles? Castaways on desert islands. So that was fairly simple. This is one of those techniques that we talk about a lot on this channel, and you hear a lot of really great songwriters talking about it. It's this idea of finding the title and really structuring the rest of the song around that title or that refrain line. And this makes a lot of sense because the title is there to communicate the central message, the core idea. It's the point of the song. But as we hear Sting talk about going backwards from the title, it becomes apparent how logical a connection this creates with the other lyrical material around it, how much clarity it brings to the process. So here is the verse and chorus for Message in a Bottle. And looking at it this way, in its finished form, we see only the linear progression. We see it top to bottom. But if we swap things around and structure it the way it was written, we get the refrain line first, Message in a Bottle. Then through a series of reflective questions such as, well, who sends messages in bottles? We get the verses appearing. And then we can see that the lines between the first line of the verse and the refrain line are really there to deliver the listener to the refrain line. I also write verses backwards. Start with the last line of 4, that's the clinching line, and so then you have to go backwards. There's no good having a good first line. Where do you go? But having something in the middle that clinches the argument is where I work from, so I tend to work backwards, reverse engineering it. Let's go a little bit deeper on this using a driving metaphor. Imagine you're sitting in your car in the driveway and you're wondering which direction to go. That first turn left or right out of the driveway will dictate the direction you take. In the same way, if we're sitting with a blank sheet of paper, that first line that we write will dictate the direction that our song takes. Now let's imagine that instead of doing that, we start with a destination in mind. We know where we're headed. We know where we want to get to. There are still lots of different ways we can get there. The title or the refrain line is that destination. It's the place we're trying to get to. And far from feeling limiting or restrictive, it often fuels the creative process because we know where we're headed, but we still get to choose the way we get there. We may take the scenic route. We may take a more direct path. The structure of the song is in no way set, but it allows us to create momentum and movement from the very beginning, knowing where we want to arrive at. Going back to Message in a Bottle for a second, if we imagine we were writing this song not with the refrain line or the title in place, but just starting from the first line, we can quickly see how many different ways that song could be written, how many different things that song could be about. So the first line is just a castaway, an island lost at sea. And if that was our first line, we could go in the direction of the castaway wondering how they got there, recounting a series of unfortunate events in a humorous tone. We could go in the direction of this being a deliberate choice. The castaway wants to be there. They want the solitude and isolation. We could go in the direction of thinking of the island as a castaway, a small Pacific island nation forgotten by the rest of the world. And in that case, the song may sound more like a geopolitical commentary. And all of these could be interesting paths to take. And it would be a great exercise to write these out and see if we can turn any of them into some interesting narratives. But as songwriters, we need to be really careful not to get stuck with too many options too early on. Because if we sit in the car long enough, if we stay in the driveway for too long, chances are we'll end up going back inside, lying on the couch and watching television. Also, I'm not saying you should never start a song with a first line. That can also be very effective. But if you do find yourself getting stuck or not being able to finish your songs, this technique might really help. Now, this technique of finding the title and working backwards works no matter what form you're writing in. But if you're writing in AABA form, a form without a chorus, a form that has a refrain line at the end of each verse instead of a chorus, this technique can be really effective because it allows the songwriter to place that refrain line at the bottom of the verse and then reverse engineer all the lyrics line by line so that by the time we arrive at that refrain line, it lands for the listener in such a powerful and impactful and satisfying way. The Paul Simon classic Still Crazy After All These Years demonstrates this beautifully. We have the song title, Still Crazy After All These Years. We see the refrain line placed at the bottom of the verse and it's repeated. And then we see the verses leading up to that moment. And what's really noticeable here is the role that rhyme is playing in leading our ear towards that refrain line. So we have the first line ending in night, second line ending in smiled, third line ending in times. But when we hear the fourth line and we drank ourselves some beers, because we know the title of the song is Still Crazy After All These Years, our ears are kind of on alert for a matched rhyme. Every element of the song is driving us towards that refrain line so that when it lands, we hear the central message reinforced and there is a satisfying resolution. So if you're writing in AABA form, this technique is incredibly effective, but Sting isn't thinking about it as specific to only that form, and he's got some interesting things to say about form. If you structure music correctly in a form that is time-tested, verse, chorus, middle eight, key change, coda, okay? That's the formula. It's worked for hundreds of years. That is already a narrative, already a distinct abstract narrative. And the music will then tell you the story, again, by free association. Just wandering around with it in your head, the music gives you a line, gives you a mood, creates a character. It's kind of a miraculous process that I don't really understand, even though I've written hundreds of songs, but I'm always grateful. Learning about song forms is a really important part of the songwriting process, and especially learning to work within the limitations and parameters of those forms, because rather than being restrictive, we are often forced to be more creative within those limitations. And once you get comfortable with a song form, you can then go about creating your own modifications or adaptations. You can go about transforming it into something that feels uniquely your own. But another thing that really jumps out from this quote is this idea that Sting does not always use the same process. He's not always looking for the title and working backwards. Sometimes he lets the music inform the lyric. And describing it as this miraculous process that he doesn't really understand gives us a fantastic insight into the way he feels about songwriting. Because here is someone who has an incredible track record. He's been commercially successful as a songwriter and artist for more than 4 decades. And yet he reveals in this statement that whilst he has his processes, whilst he has his techniques and his methods, there is an element of the songwriting process that remains elusive. And this is so important for us to remember, that there are things we can control. We can control how often we practice. We can control the way we take notes and review those notes and seek feedback. But there are some things we cannot control. There are things we don't understand about creativity. And understanding that we can't control everything, that we have to just trust the process, is an important part of any songwriter's development. I think a lot of the lyrics and the story come about by free association. You kind of pluck them out of the air. And it's only when you've written them down you think, well, where the hell did that come from? In the Soda Jerker episode, he talks about the song Walking on the Moon and how that originally began. He was in a hotel room, it was late at night, he couldn't sleep. And he says this riff just kept going around in his head. It wouldn't leave him alone. And so he got up, he walked around, he looked out the window, and there was a full moon outside. And this reveals something else about his process that you hear other songwriters talk about. He's receptive to his environment. He's actively looking for stimuli. He's noticing things. He's aware. He's open to receive whatever his environment or surroundings have to offer, knowing that this is often how songs get going. And it also shows that his process is malleable. Perhaps one of the reasons he's been able to sustain such a high standard of songwriting over such a long period of time. Sometimes he starts with a title and works backwards. Sometimes by free association, he lets the lyrics come to him. Sometimes he uses form as a starting point. And Sting really is considered one of the most thoughtful and articulate artists on the subject of songwriting, and he's clearly thought about it deeply and for a long time. And yet for all of his experience and investigation, it does remain in part a beautifully mysterious art form. Songwriting is much like trying to catch a wild animal, only you cannot kill the beast. You have to somehow trick him into being captured, and you can never use the same trick twice. There is no repeatable method. Every time it is different. And so when we sit down to write a new song, knowing that we can't just take what we did yesterday and transplant it into today's session, this helps us more accurately understand and develop a relationship with songwriting. rather than despair that we weren't able to replicate what we did last week or the week before. And every time we write songs, we learn something new. Our craft gets better. Our awareness gets sharper. And the fact that no two songwriting days are ever the same is perhaps the most joyful part of being a songwriter. Why would we want them to blur into each other? Why would we want a template that we can simply copy and paste? Why would we want a repeatable pattern that we roll out day after day? So the key takeaways are really this. If you're struggling to write and finish your songs, look at establishing a title or refrain line and set that as the destination for your song. Then work backwards and get the rest of your lyrics to arrive at that destination. Learn some of the classic song forms, pull them apart, look closely at their structures and how they're put together, and then experiment with creating your own versions of these forms. Finally, observe your surroundings. Be open and receptive to noticing what's in your room or just outside your window. Let these details along with the music inform your narrative. Happy songwriting. Bye.